balance of power on Bloomberg television. A Biden aide earlier today talking about a short-term debt limit measure being not off the table. Here with us to discuss is Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Let's get right to it. There's a lot of scramble and talk in Washington, even though I know you're on recess at the moment, about potentially a short-term extension of the debt limits, and then there's more time for these negotiations. Would you vote for that, a short-term increase?
No, I wouldn't vote for it. And let me be very clear as to why. Number one, the White House and Senate Democrats have been, frankly, messing around, hanging out, not doing the hard work. What they were, frankly, banking on is for House Republicans to not come up with an actual package to raise the debt ceiling. And they were wrong. Instead of doing the prudent thing, the fiduciary thing, and as somebody who's a former financial advisor, I understand what a fiduciary responsibility is. They didn't do that. And so now because they didn't do their homework, they want a short-term extension? I don't think so. Look, here's the key thing. The street has been saying for a very long time that Congress's ability to raise the debt ceiling is a concern. But the overarching concern is Congress's lack of ability to actually have a fiscally sustainable track record for how we're going to spend the people's money and then responsibly find a way to repay the debts that we've incurred. So the White House and Senate Democrats need to step up, do their job quickly, and not kick the can down the road.
On the subject of fiscal responsibility, I spoke with your Republican colleague in the Senate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, earlier today in the Senate hallway. I asked him whether or not revenue-raising measures should be on the table, not just spending cuts in this negotiation. Here's what he said.
I think everything should be on the table in the conversation between the President and McCarthy. I think a short-term raise is really a mistake here. And importantly, you don't go into a negotiation like this with still a lot of time left on the clock saying, give us another 30 days. I think everybody needs to recognize we need to pay the country's debts. We have enough time to do that, so they should negotiate with that in mind.
So, Congressman, it seems you're agreed on not having a short-term lift, but are you also agreed that revenue-raising measures should be on the table?
No, I don't think so. Listen, we're raising record revenue now. If you look at a percentage of our economy, the United States is raising roughly 20% of GDP in tax revenue. We've never raised this much in tax revenue in the history of the United States. So now why would we tell our innovators, our producers, our hardworking Americans, hey, you know what? We want more of your money, when the truth is Washington has a spending problem that Washington can sit down, fix, and figure out a way to ameliorate. This is one of the reasons why House Republicans have said we want to see 22-year spending cap levels on discretionary spending, and then we go from there as a way to get the nation's fiscal house in order.
Following that vote that you and your colleagues were able to get through the House and pass that bill, Speaker McCarthy joined me, and he really outlined his red lines for the president. Take a listen to this.
You know what happens with a compromise? We can get something together. It's what I sat down with the president the very beginning in February 1st. I said, Mr. President, why don't we sit down and work through it? There's two things I will not do, Mr. President. I will not raise taxes, and we will not pass a clean debt ceiling. But we can talk about everything else.
All right, so he's saying that he will not raise taxes and he will not pass a clean debt ceiling. So from that bill, what are you all prepared to cut out of? Because obviously you're going into a negotiation with more, but you're going to end up with less.
Well, let's be very clear. First of all, Senate Democrats haven't passed a bill at all. And the House and the White House doesn't have a plan at all. So right now where we are is they need to come up with a strategy for what they think is going to be palatable in order to raise the debt ceiling. I'm not going to negotiate with the media, with all due respect to you and a lot of your media colleagues. They need to come up with a plan. House Republicans are very clear. We have a strategy to curtail our spending. We have a strategy to raise the debt ceiling. And we have a strategy in order to find a way to continue to pay the nation's bills, some of which I don't agree with. Previous Congresses have encumbered us in ways that we need to reflect and change, but then we go forward. But to then say what I'm willing to give away, that's not appropriate. I've never cut any deal like that in my private life. I'm not going to start that now. Let's understand one thing that's clear. Joe Biden could have raised the debt ceiling last year when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House. He chose not to do so. He chose chose brinksmanship. He chose to hold our treasury markets in a lurch, and now he's going to have to negotiate. So I'm with the speaker on this one. Let's figure out where we land to be responsible. But at the end of the day, we have to be careful and use common sense with the people's money. It's not our personal dollars, and that's what House Republicans are committed to.
What do you make of the individual that you've now backed to be your leader and candidate for 2024, former President Donald Trump? The debt ceiling was raised cleanly under him, and he actually said it would be crazy for anyone to want to mess around with it.
Well, look, President Trump at the time had the support of a large amount of Republicans. Our debt was a lot lower than where it was at where it is right now. We had not unleashed an inflation. Let me not say we. Joe Biden and the congressional Democrats did not unleash a massive inflation, which frankly is a tax on every American, regardless of their politics, regardless of where they are on the economic spectrum. A lot of things have changed. Right now, we're in a situation where Joe Biden, in his own budget, he wanted to spend $7 trillion next year. That's just ridiculous. Everybody knows that. So he has to actually come to the table, sit down and actually negotiate. If congressional Democrats had done their job when they were in control of both chambers, they could have tried to fund their little initiatives that they wanted while also taking care of the fiscal health of the country. They chose not to. The country's not in a healthy fiscal place. And if you allow massive government spending to continue, the inflation, which has hurt so many Americans, will also continue. And that is not something even President Trump would agree with.
And as we talk about inflation, many members of your party, Congressman, have blamed the inflationary policies of this administration, the higher interest rates that have resulted from that, as a reason for the bank failures that we have seen. It seems that more banks are teetering on the brink as we speak, several regional lenders in question. We also had a Bloomberg scoop out just a few hours ago that the FDIC is looking at hitting the big banks with the fees to refill the deposit insurance fund. Do you sit on the House Financial Services Committee? Do you agree with what the FDIC may be proposing here? And would you support larger reform to the deposit insurance fund? Would Congress vote on it?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, I'm not assigning blame to Joe Biden. I'm assigning the appropriate responsibility. His American Rescue Plan created a labor shortage in our economy, which then created this inflation that's hurting every American. Anybody who's sensible and understands economics knows that. So that's number one. Number two, no, I don't support modifications to FDIC insurance. The issue we have here is that some of the regional banks were long treasuries because they didn't really understand or realize that what was going to happen with interest rate moves because of Joe Biden's reckless economic policy. But here's number three. I have a serious question about what Mary Daly has done with the San Francisco Fed. The banks that have failed, the big ones, I know Signature Bank is in New York, but First Republic and SVB, those are in the San Francisco Fed Bank. So what's actually happening with supervisory controls with respect to the Federal Reserve? I want to actually see the notes from the regulatory reviews of these banks and what the response was from bank leadership. And listen, you're not just talking to a congressman. I worked in community banking before I got to Congress. So I understand that the regulators do have an impact on the corporate boards of these banks and how they choose to compile their bank balance sheets and what that looks like, either from the balance sheet or from the deposit base. So what was actually going on in these regulatory reviews? That's a major question that needs to be answered before we start talking about more capital or new regulations.
All right. Great to get the perspective of both a congressman and former community banker, Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Thank you so much for joining us.